Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into a stack of information and pull out the most important insights, just for you. Today we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive. We're going into the earliest history of what we now call China. And we should probably forget what we think we know about its ancient origins. Our sources, well, they reveal this dynamic landscape, diverse peoples, and the surprising birth of complex societies long before a unified China even existed.
It really is a journey into a truly formative era. We'll see how the very land itself shaped these early cultures and, how the interaction of vastly different groups laid the fundamental groundwork for a civilization that would endure for millennia. There are some genuinely surprising facts in here about how society, governance, even spiritual beliefs first took root in this incredibly dynamic environment.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this. Let's explore the pre-Chinese origins of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. So our journey starts with the very first Homo sapiens who ventured into this region. And here's something I found genuinely surprising. Early settlement wasn't mainly from the north, like you might assume. It was primarily from the south.
Yeah, through India and Indochina.
Right. And this movement, it set up a higher population density down south, especially once people started, settling down.
And one striking detail here is how incredibly dynamic the landscape itself was. I mean, really changing. For instance, you take the Shandong Peninsula. Today, it's almost the heartland of later Chinese civilization, right? Well, about 10,000 years ago, it was actually an island, separated by this huge strait.
An island? Wow.
Yeah. It only fully connected to the mainland around 3000 BCE as the water levels dropped. Just imagine that, a major region starting out completely isolated.
And that receding water, it didn't just connect land, it created a massive challenge, didn't it? Especially for the future.
Oh, definitely. That vast Great Chinese Plain, between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers.
Yeah.
Around 3000 BCE, it was still forming. We're talking swamps, bogs, and incredibly salty, really infertile soil.
So not exactly prime real estate yet.
Not at all. It took another 1,000 years, well into the Bronze Age, for that salt to finally leach out enough for the land to become truly arable. Even with advanced irrigation or drainage techniques they might have developed later, that struggle just dealing with the ground beneath their feet, it really defined so much of what came next.
Okay, so this brings us to, two distinct groups of early settlers emerging from that landscape.
Exactly. Fundamentally distinct. Down south, around the Yangtze Basin, you find the Austronesian language speakers. These are the ancestors of today's Southeast Asian peoples.
Ah, okay.
And they were the early adopters of agriculture. They were cultivating rice as early as 8,000 BCE. Amazing, isn't it?
8,000 BCE.
Yeah, thriving in those warm, humid subtropics. And they primarily raised water buffalo.
Rice and water buffalo. Got it.
But then, around 6,000 BCE, a completely different group arrives. From the west this time. These are the Sino-Tibetan speakers.
Okay, different language group, different direction.
And different agriculture. Their life centered around millet, not wheat, specifically millet, and they were primarily pig herders.
Millet and pigs.
Right. And their development, both agriculturally and socially, it was, maybe a bit slower paced than their southern counterparts initially.
So you've got these two worlds almost. Rice and water, buffalo south, millet and pigs north. Profoundly different ways of life.
Absolutely. Impacting everything from diet to economy to even their social structures. And what's truly remarkable, I think, is how the collision, the interaction of these two distinct cultures, the Austronesian rice folks and the Sino-Tibetan millet folks, right there in those fertile interriverine regions.
Yeah.
That's what gave birth to the future Huaxia people, the direct ancestors of modern Chinese. Their emergence, it just fundamentally reshaped the whole region.
So how did this blending reshape everything? It wasn't just mixing, was it?
No, not at all. These hybrid Huaxia cultures, they didn't just merge, they became incredibly adaptable. That was their key characteristic, really. And that adaptability ultimately allowed them to surpass both their parent cultures in development.
Oh, so?
Well, they became versatile. They could cultivate both rice and millet. They could raise both cattle and pigs. They mastered both bronze and jade work.
So they took the best of both worlds, almost.
In a way, yeah. And this versatility, especially when facing the massive challenge of reclaiming that difficult Great Chinese Plain we talked about.
Right, the salty swamps.
That was their secret weapon. It made them incredibly successful.
Okay, so this journey, this blending, this overcoming the environment, it eventually leads to the Shang dynasty.
Exactly. Appearing around 1500 BCE.
And they mark the true beginning of, historical time in China.
Pretty much, yeah. Largely because their writing system, the stuff on the oracle bones, has been deciphered, so we can actually read their records.
Makes sense?
They were a sophisticated bronze civilization, known for military innovations like chariots.
Ah, chariots are always cool.
They are, though interestingly, they actually borrowed the chariot idea from nomadic peoples to their north.
Oh, really? So not homegrown?
Nope. But they also had the jedge, that distinctive dagger axe. That seems more local.
Okay. But what truly set the Shang apart? What was their unique cultural stamp?
Well, what was truly unique and what leaves such an enduring legacy was their deep immersion in ancestral worship. This ancient cult, it was absolutely central to their identity, particularly in how they governed and their spirituality.
Ancestor worship. Central to governing. How did that work?
The Shang king wasn't just a ruler in the political sense. He was essentially the chief shaman.
The head priest, basically.
Exactly. The direct intermediary between the living and the dead ancestors. And divination using those oracle bones.
Right, the turtle shells, cattle bones.
Typically turtle plastrons or cattle scapulae, yeah. That was integral to state policy, not just personal stuff.
So you, what, scratch a question onto the bone?
Yeah, scratch a question, heat it until it cracked.
And then read the cracks.
And interpret the patterns, yes. And you'd ask your ancestors about everything. Will there be misfortune if we offer 5 oxen or 6? Stuff like that.
Okay, that's pretty specific.
But it wasn't just, personal fortune telling. Major state decisions, where to build a canal, when to declare war, even when to harvest, were made based on these divine consultations.
Wow. So policy by seance, almost.
In a way. And the very act of writing on these bones held a sacred value. So scribes were incredibly respected figures. They were both scholars and priests.
That's a fascinating blend of power, isn't it? Literacy, religion, politics, all tied up.
Indeed. And we also see other, perhaps more startling cultural traits, like human sacrifice.
Oh. Yeah, that comes up a lot in ancient cultures.
It does. Often war captives, but sometimes it seems even willing relatives were included in elite burials.
Willing in quotes, maybe.
Possibly. And perhaps even more surprisingly, in construction. Children were frequently buried in the foundations of important buildings.
Children. Why?
It was likely a protective ritual, to ward off evil spirits.
Grim stuff.
It is. And this practice also kind of hints at a strong xenophobia. A fear of outsiders. The idea was that outsiders who died away from their native land were especially feared to become malevolent spirits.
Okay, interesting connection there. What about architecture, besides burying kids in the foundations?
Architecturally, the Shang innovated by adopting and then really scaling up rammed earth construction.
Rammed earth.
Yeah, packing soil tightly between forms. It's a technique they actually borrowed from those southern Austronesian peoples we mentioned earlier.
Another example of borrowing and adapting.
Exactly. But what I find really telling, the dominant building in their cities wasn't the temple, it was the palace.
The ruler's palace.
Yes. Even though the king was the chief shaman communicating with spirits, the prominence of the palace suggests the secular ruler's power was incredibly central. It hints at this kind of pragmatic focus, maybe a core principle of Chinese governance that we see echoed down through the ages.
That's a great point. Practical power alongside spiritual duty.
And we even see the early sort of rudimentary concepts of yin and yang emerging during this period, though initially it seems they just meant something simple like day and night.
Fascinating. Okay, so the Shang were powerful, innovative, deeply religious, but they didn't last forever.
No dynasty does. The Shang era eventually gave way to the Zhou dynasty.
Zhou, right. They conquered the Shang around, what was it?
Around 1027 BCE. And though the Zhou were originally a Sino-Tibetan group themselves.
Like the northern millet farmers way back.
Kind of, yeah. But they largely absorbed and carried forward the Huaxia culture that the Shang had established. They became its new stewards, essentially.
So more continuity than complete rupture.
A lot of continuity, yes, but they also introduced something huge. One of the most enduring and pivotal concepts in all of Chinese history.
Which was?
The mandate of heaven. Tanming.
The mandate of heaven. Okay, I've heard of that. But what did it really mean back then? It wasn't just divine right, like in Europe, right?
No, not quite. Heaven, or Tan, wasn't necessarily a single anthropomorphic deity. It was more like a cosmic force, cosmic justice. And this cosmic force sanctioned a virtuous ruler. But critically, it would withdraw its blessing, its mandate, from a corrupt or incompetent one.
Ah, okay, so it's conditional.
Highly conditional. If a king became, say, a drunken tyrant or neglected his duties, heaven would withdraw its mandate.
And how would people know heaven was unhappy?
That's the crucial part. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes were seen as clear signs.
Omens from heaven?
Exactly. And even popular uprisings, rebellions, those too were interpreted as undeniable signs that the current dynasty had lost the mandate.
So if a rebellion succeeded,
It was automatic proof. Heaven favored the new rulers. The success itself legitimized them.
that's an incredible way to frame power, isn't it? It builds in a justification for overthrowing the government.
It absolutely does. But did it also create maybe a sense of instability, knowing that any disaster could be read as a sign of doom for the rulers?
That's a perceptive question. And it's a dynamic that definitely played out over the centuries.
This cyclical view of history dynasties rise, rule well, get the mandate, then decline, become corrupt, lose the mandate, get overthrown, and a new virtuous dynasty rises that profoundly shaped Chinese political thought for millennia.
Wow, for how long?
From the Zhou era all the way to 1911 when the last emperor was overthrown. And you could even argue its echoes linger into the 20th century. It legitimizes change not just through brute force, but through this idea of cosmic approval and moral fitness.
That's huge. Okay, so besides the mandate of heaven, what else did the zoo bring?
Well, they brought a new governance model, while the central king, the Wang, held the mandate.
The main guy.
Right. He delegated actual rule over territories to relatives and allies. It was a kind of decentralized feudal system.
Like medieval Europe, sort of?
Similar structure in some ways, yes. And this system required extensive written records. Who controlled what, obligations, genealogies, all that stuff, which led to a massive increase in the number of scribes and chroniclers.
Which is fantastic for us today, right? More sources.
Absolutely. It gives us far more detailed historical accounts from this period compared to the Shang.
Nice. Any other zoo innovations stand out?
Yes, actually. Beyond the scribes, this period also saw the rise of the engineer as a highly respected state official.
The engineer. Interesting.
Yeah, their names were even recorded in official annals sometimes. They oversaw massive public works projects, like early fortifications against nomadic tribes coming from the west and north. These were essentially the very, very first attempts at what would eventually, much later, become the Great Wall.
The beginnings of the Great Wall under the zoo. Wow.
And they also strategically created these buffer states on their periphery, basically setting up allied or subordinate kingdoms on the frontiers to handle threats.
Makes sense, like shields.
Exactly. And one of those buffer states they set up in the west was the state of Qin.
Qin, like Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor.
The very same state, which, in a great twist of historical irony, would eventually grow powerful enough to conquer all the other states, including the Zhou homeland, and unify China.
So the zoo created the state that would eventually destroy them and take over. Wild.
History has its ironies.
Okay, so the Zhou dynasty, it lasted a long time, right? The longest.
It did, nearly 800 years on paper. But that central Zhou power gradually declined.
Which leads into the spring and autumn period.
Precisely, a tumultuous time. Though the Zhou king still technically held the mandate of heaven in name, the real power shifted to these regional hegemons.
Hegemons, like powerful local lords.
Exactly. Powerful dukes and marquises who were nominally Zhou vassals, but were increasingly acting like independent rulers, constantly vying for control and influence.
Sounds chaotic.
It was. But amidst this fragmentation, we see some significant cultural shifts. One is the gradual disappearance of human sacrifice.
So it's a positive step.
Definitely. Instead of ritualistically offering actual humans, there's a clear rise in more symbolic offerings, things like terracotta figures, perhaps.
Like the terracotta army, but earlier, smaller versions.
Possibly related ideas, yeah. It indicates a profound shift in religious practices, maybe a growing emphasis on more abstract forms of worship, or just changing values.
Okay. And how did all that chaos and shifting power impact daily life and how things were run?
Well, the role of the bureaucrat, the administrator, became absolutely crucial for these competing states.
Managing the chaos?
Trying to. Good officials were so highly valued that, get this, even after their death, their spirits could apparently be consulted at special altars.
Consulted.
People would offer bribes, like oil or millet, expecting guidance on governance in return, from the ghost of the official.
You're kidding. People were bribing dead bureaucrats for advice.
According to the sources, yes. It's wild, isn't it? It just highlights how deeply ingrained and respected that administrative class became. Bureaucracy was serious business.
Wow. Okay, what else was changing?
Well, beyond these shifts in belief in administration, society itself was undergoing massive transformations with the arrival of the Iron Age in this period.
Iron. That's always a game changer.
Huge impact. Primarily, iron was used for agriculture first. Plows, tools,
Better farming.
much better, which significantly boosted food production and, consequently, population growth. More people, bigger armies, bigger cities.
Did they use iron for weapons too? Or stick with bronze?
Bronze remained dominant for high-quality weapons for quite a while. It holds a better edge initially, but iron definitely saw increasing use in swords, spearheads, other implements too. It was cheaper and more abundant.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
More fighting meant.
More military innovations. Cavalry started to appear, riding horses in warfare, though initially it was kind of disdained by some traditionalists as a barbarian tactic.
Cavalry seen as barbarian.
Yeah.
Funny how things change.
Isn't it? And siege engineering got much more advanced. They developed sophisticated techniques like diverting rivers to flood besieged cities.
River diverting. That sounds intense.
It was brutal. Techniques later adopted and perfected by conquerors like the Mongols, actually.
So this whole era, constant competition, shifting power, new technologies, intellectual ferment.
Exactly. That ferment is key. It also gave birth to what we call the 100 schools of thought.
Ah, the philosophers.
Yes, this includes figures like Laozi, the sort of legendary founder of Taoism.
Go with the flow.
In a nutshell, yeah. And, crucially, Confucius.
Kung Fu.
Confucius, probably the most famous name from this whole period.
Absolutely. And while later Confucianism would sometimes become a very rigid state doctrine,
Confucius himself, living in this chaotic spring and autumn period, was arguably much more pragmatic. He was advocating for order, obedience, filial piety, yes, but also, crucially, for moral leadership in a world that seemed to have lost its way.
moral leadership. How did he frame that?
Well, he famously compared governing to managing a river. Instead of just building a huge dam to stop the river, which he argued inevitably leads to disaster when the dam breaks, a wise ruler should guide the river's flow, work with its nature.
Oh, so guide people through moral example and proper rituals, not just brute force.
Precisely. It was actually a pretty radical idea for his time, emphasizing moral authority and ethical persuasion over sheer power and coercion.
And that idea would stick around, wouldn't it?
Profoundly. It influenced Chinese political philosophy for millennia. It's a concept still debated and interpreted today.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big picture here? What does this deep dive tell us?
Well, we've journeyed through China's very deep prehistory, haven't we? We've seen a land that was literally still forming under people's feet.
Yeah, the swamps and the island peninsula.
And settled by these really distinct cultures, Austronesian race farmers, Sino-Tibetan millet farmers who clashed but also blended.
Creating the Huaxi identity.
Exactly, this adaptable, resilient cultural core.
We've seen how that struggle with the landscape shaped their farming, their innovations.
And how ancestor worship became absolutely central to statecraft under the Shang, with those oracle bones deciding policy.
And then the zoo bringing the mandate of heaven, that revolutionary idea of cosmic justice holding rulers accountable.
Right, providing the cyclical framework for governance, rise and fall, based on virtue that endured for thousands of years, justifying both stability and rebellion.
It really is a story of constant adaptation, isn't it? Borrowing ideas like chariots or rammed earth.
And innovating, like the mandate or new philosophies, from the very first rice paddies to the sacred oracle bones.
From the powerful Shang to the foundational zoo.
And through that intellectual explosion in the spring and autumn period, China's core identity was really forged in these dynamic, often quite brutal early centuries.
So I guess the biggest takeaway is China isn't this single isolated thing that just popped into existence fully formed.
Not at all. It's this incredibly complex tapestry, woven from diverse threads, different peoples, different ideas, different environments, continuously adapting, adopting, reinterpreting its past. The very struggles and interactions of these early peoples didn't just create a civilization, they created a remarkably resilient one, built on these deep layers of tradition and constant innovation.
So for you, the listener, maybe consider this. How do these ancient foundations are easier? Things like that cyclical view of history, the emphasis on a moral ruler, maybe even the deep-seated value placed on bureaucracy and order, how might they still echo in modern China today? Could understanding these incredibly deep roots going back thousands of years before even the first emperor change your perspective on current events or societal attitudes in ways you hadn't considered before? Something to think about.
Thanks for diving deep with us.